When I wrote this book, I had published a couple of books, but I didn't make enough money, so I had to have a part-time job besides being a writer, and I was just having an office job with like administrative work, and it really didn't make that much sense to me. And then when I had my first child, when I came back to work, I came from this world of taking care of an infant where there's actually no day and night, and it was like a veil was ripped from my eyes of how we order our lives into like a very private domestic life and a public work life. So I came from this soft world, being up at night, all my senses were heightened, and I was just taking care of another person, being very close. And then when I came back to work, it just seemed so absurd, just not touching skin, for example, for that much time, just touching the keyboard. I mean, I don't know, I feel like I'm sitting like this. And it became very obvious to me that there was a conflict between loyalties, that I had some loyalties towards my child and my family, but I was expected to have complete loyalty with the workplace. And it didn't make sense to me, and increasingly my office job just became grotesque, to me at least. It became like an absurd, hard world. And I began to really listen to this kind of newspeak, these expressions we would use in the workplace, like I have to be more efficient, I have to work to better my workflow, how can I develop my talents, how can I will go down to human resources, and I found this language actually pretty scary, and it was like the language itself was turning the workers into instruments. They were like objectifying themselves. So I wanted to take this sort of language into a literary setting and examine it, and take the idea that was inside somewhere in this language. There's a sort of ideology, and I wanted to take it to the extreme. So I began writing the employees. And when I finished the book and I turned it into my editor, I quit my job on the same day. And I haven't had a boss for 5 years, and I recommend it. It was not like I sat down and had the thought that I'm going to write about how the language of efficiency can make us feel humanized. It was more organic than that. And before that actually came a wish. I really wanted to write science fiction. Some people say that the definition of science fiction is a book about mistrusting a certain technology. And I had perhaps a mistrust to the technology of the workplace, or of this kind of language, if you can say that. And I also really wanted to write about ecology and what makes us feel like we belong to something. Is it our work? Is that the most important part of our identity? And if I listen beneath that, what other kinds, how deep can I actually go to feel like, how do I belong? So I wanted to write about actually how the human body is a part of the planet's ecology and the earth actually. So I think it was almost intuitively that I made the decision of taking the characters away from their ecology. So it's very much a book about being misplaced, actually, being misplaced from your landscape, from your land, but also perhaps being misplaced in a sort of work setting, being placed in a sort of situation where you're told you're one thing, but you're actually more than that. So, and I think it was the reason I chose for it to take place in the future. There were two things that I really wanted to work with in this novel regarding the reader, and I really wanted to activate the body of the reader. So it's a book that's talking a lot to your senses that are not sight. I wanted to really activate your taste, this feeling of skin, smell, to show that we also read with the body, and to make the reader kind of experience the same sensual awakening as the characters. And I also realized that, okay, I have two types of characters. I have human characters, I have humanoid characters, and I actually have to work really hard in order to make people empathize with the humanoid characters. So I began writing texts where I don't know which category is speaking, because then you have to look for signs. And if you like, your first impulse is to side with the humans, I think it will be the impulse. You suddenly ask yourself, okay, is this a human speaking? How do I actually know? Okay, I empathize with this person, perhaps it's a humanoid. So I wanted to make that unease move into the reader, because I love that myself. And I am not at all interested in motive. Sometimes I will have a discussion with my editor or my editors, and they will be like, but what is she feeling? Or why is she doing this? And what is his reason for doing this? And it can be important, but I actually really like that sort of, even like in a fairy tale, where somebody will chop off their own hand and you don't really know why. Well, I think that we have to talk about this question in two parts, because we can, when we look at technology, which actually just means tools, we can look at what we create as tools, like dead things, like a hammer or AI, electricity, a car. It's just a tool. So in some traditional sci-fi, when there's a mistrust towards technology, it's because not the technology in itself, but how humans are using it. Like, what will happen to Pandora's box if it lands in the wrong hands, right? So it's still a story about how we will use tools, and how to use it for good and how to use it for destruction. In the novel, I wanted to turn that point of view around and say, okay, let's not look at creation like something that will always lead us to a dangerous tool. And if in some future, in some way, we manage to create an artificial life form, I think it's interesting that there is so much fear, that there is the notion and idea that the first thing this creation would like to do is to destroy us. If you read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, there's a monster, but it's actually not a very aggressive or destructive monster until it's been, excluded for the collective, and then it becomes angry, or he becomes angry. So I wanted to say, okay, let's look, if we actually create some sentient being, let's not be Oedipal about it. Let's not have a patriarchal idea of a son always wanting to kill the father, Well, I really change opinion all the time. So I'm like a very unfaithful reader. I will rarely finish a book, and I try to read all different things. So for the last couple of years, I've been really into reading someone called Hildegard of Bingen, which is a German nun that lived in the 1100s. She has this beautiful short text called The Threads of Air, where she talks about that when there's a war going on between summer and winter, and when winter ends and summer wins, the air becomes filled with threads that are visible. For me, it has been like a portal into just getting rid of old ideas of how to write about nature and the cosmos. Another writer I really want to recommend is a Danish writer called Tove Ditlevsen that has had a resurgence the last 5 years. She was from Copenhagen, and she wrote a trilogy called the Copenhagen Trilogy, which was memoir fiction about her own life, and she was a working class writer. She's sort of like the Danish Elena Ferrante. And so the first book is about her childhood, the second book is about youth, and the third book is about marriage, but it's also very much about how she was a drug addict, an opium addict. And she's just ruthless, and her sentence is so sharp. And she's been a very important writer for me. She's always been in print in Denmark, but for many years she was considered bad taste, like a woman's writer. So I would read her as a 11-year-old child and read her poetry. And she wrote a bunch, almost 30, 40 books, but when you get to she's getting older and she starts writing the Copenhagen Trilogy, she's really in full power. So I would really recommend those books. Those some of the best Danish literature. I'm not sure she's translated, but she's translated into English. It's a Japanese poet called Hiromi Ito, which is a contemporary poet. She wrote poems all through the 80s and 90s, and she is just like, I don't know, a shamanistic punk queen. I would recommend the collection of poetry called Killing Kanoko. She writes a lot about magic and a lot about sex and a lot about food. And I would also recommend like an epic poem novel of hers that's called Wild Grass on the Riverbank, which is about a family of a mother and some children that live in this weird house. And one of the things I like about her, and especially about Wild Grass on the Riverbank, is that she's not really a believer in death as a punctuation. I mean, dead bodies speak, flowers speak, everything speaks. This is gonna be such a cliche, but I think one writer that I keep on returning to is the poet Paul Celan, because I think he's just one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, and there's just he touches something with his poetry that is very rarely touched